Hello, my name is Connor.
And I'm Jason.
And you're listening to the Amazed and Perplexed podcast.
So we concluded in our last episode the Sermon on the Plain. We do recognize there's lots of elements of the Sermon on the Mount that we did not cover, that the Sermon on the Plain does not cover. And either in future episodes or maybe just taking all of our episodes and putting them together, because the Sermon on the Mount, it certainly merits that kind of exploration.
Sure. Yeah. Well, if you are an active listener of us, you know that what our plans for that will look like next week could be vastly different than now. But at some point, we will work through specifically the things we didn't get a chance to that aren't covered on the Sermon on the Plain.
Excellent. But moving forward, and just to draw us back in, our goal with what we're doing now, I guess you could call it a series, but it's walking through primarily the Synoptic Gospels, looking over Jesus' shoulder and giving dignity to everyone involved. And so, for example, today we're going to look at Luke 7, and Jesus is, he had just had the experience with the centurion that we covered a few weeks, or not a few at this time, I don't know, 10 episodes ago at this point. But he's had that experience. He was amazed by the centurion, and then he encounters a funeral. And I just think there's a lot of fascinating cultural things that maybe I don't even know that are happening here. But I think it's really significant. So I'm excited to, as we're looking over Jesus' shoulder, we're looking around the room, as it were, around the space, and imagining what's this like culturally, how does this feel? I'm just curious, what jumps out at you in setting this up?
Yeah, I think this is, there are some cultural elements that maybe would be harder for us to understand, but just the base level of what's happening here. Jesus, the story is focusing a lot on the mother of this dead son. And I think there are probably a lot of reasons for that. But one of the reasons that I think we can all understand is there's something that Luke is wanting us to see here. He's wanting us to see the grief. I think he's wanting us to focus to a certain extent on what this is. Because if the story is just there was a dead man and Jesus walked up and he rose him from the dead, you're like, that's amazing, that's cool. But in the same way, the story of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead is so powerful when he encounters the grief and the distraughtness, if you will. That lends so much to the story, and it helps give you a better understanding of certainly who Jesus is, but how he's going about the world. And so giving dignity to the mom and the woman here, it'd be so easy to just be like, and Jesus did this crazy cool thing, and Jesus is amazing and powerful. Part of the cool thing that Jesus is doing here is not only is he doing this crazy, cool, powerful, amazing thing, but he's also giving a mother her son back. And there's a lot of cultural elements to that of, she's a widow. And so, the only son that she has, the only way to provide, the only certain person who would actually help provide for it, there's so many elements of just beyond the fact of a mother getting her son back, but there's so much Jesus is doing, and it'd be so easy to not give dignity to the woman. And it's fascinating that Luke does record Jesus giving this dignity to her.
Yeah, and I think another aspect that jumps out at me just from what I know is that death and specifically touching the dead and how the dead are handled, a lot is covered. It's interesting, when somebody dies in our culture now, most families that call me and say, hey, we need help with the funeral, or hey, will you officiate this? They know nothing. They've probably had zero experience. And honestly, I think most Americans try to avoid it. We want to keep it sterilized, clean, quick, honestly. Now, grief isn't quick. But if we could control grief, it'd be quick. We'd cry for half an hour and be done with it, But our culture is not super comfortable with that. Their culture had rules. They had lots of rules. And touching dead people would make you unclean. I don't know exactly about, and we'll see Jesus' interaction here, but it's safe to say at the very least, keeping in mind, these people, including Jesus, are all under the old covenant at this point. And so all the rules about the dead and how to handle the dead, even the fact they're carrying him out of town, which would be, very specific and very detailed about how that was to be done. There is structure, there is order. Yeah. And so even thinking right now through that, he's disruptive in many settings. We've already looked at at least one, if not two, encounters where he disrupts the Sabbath proceedings and just not simply that event, but then you're thinking about what does it mean about all the other Sabbaths, this kind of thing. And so I think it's important to keep that in mind. And you made this point, and I want to make sure it's clear. The fact that this woman is a widow matters. The fact that he's the only son matters, because now you're talking about where will she get her income from? What are her options going to be? Because it quickly goes to very menial labor, and maybe a lot of physical and financial loss that's about to come her way. So he is definitely stepping in the middle of something that is, it's devastating.
That's good. That's good. So we are in Luke chapter 7, starting in verse 11. Soon afterward, Jesus went to a town called Nain. Is it Nain? Yeah.
We're going to go with Nain.
Nain, fair enough. And his disciples and a large crowd went along with him. As he approached the town gate, a dead person was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a large crowd from the town was with her. When the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her, and he said, "Don't cry." Then he went up and touched the bear. Bear? Oh,
I would have accepted either.
fair enough. Gosh, I'm keeping on. If it had just been one time, I would have edited it out. But because I did both pronunciations, I'm gonna keep.
There you go.
I'm gonna keep it all in. They were carrying him on, and the bear stood still. He said, "Young man, I say to you, get up." The dead man sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. They were all filled with awe and praised God. A great prophet has appeared among us, they said. God has come to help his people. This news about Jesus spread throughout Judea and the surrounding country. So, Jason, what amazes you?
I just love the interruption and how awkward. I mean, when you're in the middle of awkward, you feel like this is going to last forever. Like you don't think, well, it'll be done in 1 minute. You know, when you're first feeling, you're like, oh. And I love that moment. I think it's that he starts talking. Is he finishing a sentence? Like, did he die? Because we don't know anything about the cause of his death, the nature of his death. So is he like, and another thing I love about tapioca or whatever, and then he dies and then his first words, like, it's just fascinating. It's fascinating that they mention it.
Yeah.
But the power of interrupting something that in any culture, I would imagine, is awkward, just the interruption at all. And then for him that picture of him giving him back is the words, helping this guy up. He's talking. I don't know if Jesus is interacting with the conversation, if it is a conversation, and just helping him walk down to his mother, imagining that embrace, imagining probably this son's, and we don't know if this son is young or old. We have no idea about that. But he probably doesn't know he died, is probably it. And so what's going on? Why are we here? Why are we at the outside of the city? Who are these people? Why are they carrying this, box, that I was in? And him catching up to all these deeds. There's so many waves. And as I, again, look around the area, for the crowd to go from offended or scared or whatever, angry, and then to be stunned.
Yeah.
And I want to borrow that stunned feeling, because it just will never get unamazing that a person you factually know is dead. Wow, they're alive again. It's completely inexplicable.
Yeah, there's a piece here where we always like to talk about how interruptible Jesus is, and there's a part here where you go, man, Jesus is also not afraid of interrupting us. He's not afraid of interrupting solemn ceremonies. These people would have known exactly what their funeral would be like from the moment they were conscious. There was, like he says, a very prescribed thing. And the fact that Jesus is both so okay with being, his plans being changed by the people around him and being moved by different people. Yet there's a piece here. I just think it's so incredible to me that Jesus, it's a good reminder for me that there are well-worn paths that I assume that my life or your life or the church will follow down. And I think oftentimes Jesus is, I think just like Jesus is here, Jesus is often looking at you and me and wanting to break up those well-worn paths that we always have assumed are the way that things are supposed to be, even down to the very prescriptions that we would think we received directly from God and how we were supposed to do something. And so the fact that Jesus is so disruptible and so disrupting at the same time, it speaks so much to who he is and who I think he's supposed to be in our lives. And that piece you touched on about the awkwardness of it. I think awkwardness in a lot of ways tends to kind of be one of the great sins of our modern day, and just trying to understand, trying to get to that, get to being okay with the idea of Jesus doing the equivalent here and now. Because there are things, right? There have to be things that Jesus wants to do in a similar vein. There has to be ways that he wants to interrupt and he wants to cause that sort of stunned feeling. And if I'm looking for it, I bet I can find it, and I bet I can pick it out where Jesus has done that. But yeah, I love imagining the awkwardness of the before, the stunnedness of the after, and then that Jesus just lets them all work through that. Jesus doesn't sit through and be like, okay, let's have a counseling session and let's work. Like, there's so much here that is just so. It just speaks like it's such a small story, and yet I think you get such a big piece of Jesus.
Absolutely. Well, and the thing I think about, and this just popped in my mind listening to what you were saying, is I had a mentor one time tell me there are no interruptions. And of course, you're like, of course there are interruptions, but you base the reason you think it's an interruption is because you had a plan. Mm-hmm. And you could say, well, no, everybody accepts that when you go into work, if you have a 9-to-5 job, if something impedes that, that's an interruption. And part of this is semantics, but I do think it's a useful challenge because it's like, well, who decided 9 to 5 was the reality? And obviously for many people, 9 to 5 is.
Sure.
But you get the point is, well, of course, when you're doing this, you should see it on to completion or else there's something wrong, And it's like, okay, can we just own the fact that's a very human idea? It's a construct, it's a concept that we have used to frame it. And we immediately ask, because we're so time-centered, even going to something enjoyable, how long is this movie or this game or this whatever we're going to? And all of a sudden, so you're at a game that's outside and you're like, oh, there's lightning. Well, now we've had this interruption. We've had this delay. Based on what? Well, we made it up. We made up that baseball games should last this long and football games should last, or whatever, Sure. And I understand it's not that I'm against structure and time constraints. We live in time. But it's that idea that this would have looked like not just an interruption, but an extremely offensive and actually religiously violating interruption, because he's touching the beer. He's touching it. And they wouldn't have included it had it not been significant. Mm-hmm. You don't touch it.
Yeah.
And that's the thing is and then he tells the mom not to cry. I mean, like, come on,
Yeah.
Heal first, then say don't cry. Mm-hmm. So it's just he is this idea, and how you did it, I think is how I want to think about it. That idea of, okay, this is happening. I wasn't planning on this. I wonder if this is God.
Yeah. Well, and the hard part, I think the battle for me is always, there are times when like you can hold to your structure and it's good and kind and wise and loving to follow through with the plan. But oftentimes when my anger or frustration comes with interruption, comes because I had an idea for how the world was going to work or how this day was going to unfold, or and my idea was taken away from me. Now, obviously, in the realm of funeral, you'd be like, yeah, of course, like God can interrupt my plans to have this funeral. But like, I think in all honesty, I think it's important to remember that, yeah, in hindsight, is the mother happy, right, that Jesus intervened and interrupted? Of course. But there was a good chunk of time before her son was raised from the dead, that she was deeply offended and hurt by the actions of Jesus, or upset or frustrated or confused. And so for me, I want to remember that that when I feel like God has interrupted me, or feel like the Holy Spirit is doing something different and moving me off my path, that if I'm frustrated or uncomfortable or confused at what God is doing, that doesn't necessarily mean I'm in bad company.
Yeah, absolutely. So what amazes you?
So in verse 13, it says, when the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her, and he said, don't cry. And there's a piece, maybe we'll get to in perplexing, of the don't cry. Other versions will say that Jesus had compassion for her, but I love the NIV translation of his heart going out to her. And much of my work, I feel like, in the past couple of years, is learning how to rest in the loving arms of the Father. And there are so many things that we can talk about when it comes to Jesus, and his brilliant. We just did a whole series on the Sermon on the Plain and the brilliant teachings and the way he interacts and goes about people and his brilliant theological explanations and his worldview and how people are formed and all these just really incredibly smart and intricate and cool things. And all those are great to talk about and all those are great to remember. But this is at the core of what the gospel is that God entered into human space and took on the frailty of the human frame and experienced the muck and the mire with us, and not just felt pain himself, but had empathy and had compassion, and felt that pain with us. And so for me, it's so simple, and I think I'll do it to the day I die. Most of my work is always getting back to this place of reminding myself of, if Jesus didn't come and he didn't care, he didn't have compassion, then all these other things are ultimately not worth my time. This is the fact that this is who God is, that God is a God that his heart goes out for somebody. He has compassion for somebody's pain that he knows he's about to reverse. If that's not who God is, then I don't see what the point of this is. But the fact that this is who God is, means he's everything.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it does. And this kind of, if you flip this and say, so this ties into what perplexes me, is he's everything. He can do this. We learned that he's the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow, that God doesn't change. Now, God's methods change. There's different methodology, different ways he does things in different situations. In the Old Testament, he seems to have almost a fixation on not repeating the action, even if the required solution is the same, meaning he needs the same result. And I've talked, I think, before about how do you cross a body of water using God's way? Well, there's several different ways of how the water was parted, and then Jesus walks across the water. So which is the right way? Mm-hmm. And it's like, no, he can use any way he wants. And don't think he only has 4 ways. He's got a billion ways.
No, I've always took that to mean that Jesus says you can't jet ski, because Jesus did not jet ski. I know that.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So that's the thing, is his creativity is to be expected, not that, oh, what an anomaly. And humans, we try to do the opposite. We're trying to, how do we get this down to predictability and certainty and control, basically, is what we're saying. And then we get flustered because what I perceive as interruptions a lot of times is me thinking there's only one way to get this done, So, but back to that idea of perplexing, I didn't even notice this until right now, is it's not like Jesus. I've always thought about this story with Jesus coming in alone. And it's like, well, how dumb were you? Because it clearly says he's got his disciples. And keep in mind, that doesn't mean it's just the 12. Yeah. There could be hundreds of disciples with him. And then it says not just a crowd, but a large crowd. So there potentially may be a bigger entourage with Jesus than the funeral procession is representing. Although, in Nain, I don't know, if it doesn't seem like a big city. I could track that down, of course, at least estimations. But you may have 2 very large groups joining. So all of a sudden, it's amped up dramatically. Mm-hmm. Just the awkwardness, the offense. It's one thing for me to quietly enter a situation and say, "Hey, have you thought about this?" Mm-hmm. It's another thing for him with an entourage to say, "Stop what you're doing." Okay, who are you? And obviously, we know he's the savior of the world.
Sure.
But stop what you're doing, and I'm going to do this. And it comes down to, and a lot of times, perplexing dynamics come down to, how do we apply this? Because I don't believe that I can predict that I'm going to raise the dead. Let me say it that way. I also can't say that God won't do it. Mm-hmm. And then I have to wonder, and this is a perplexing thing, how do I say this clearly? Would God do more if I trusted him? And it's so dumb the way I'm about to say this. If I trusted him enough to interrupt. Mm-hmm. I think I spend a bunch of my time asking, how do I fit in? What's the, quote, right way to do this, defined by culture? And I wonder if part of Jesus's secret is that he's like, I am willing to do whatever God asks me. And so then he gets to participate in things I don't get to participate in because I am unwilling.
Yeah. I think the answer is yes. And not just,
I don't like that answer.
Not just for you. I think the answer, I think about it all the time. And I think, how often do I allow my pride or my desire to be seen as cool, or not one of those Christians, or whatever it would be? How often is my perception of myself and wanting to be seen in a specific way getting in way in the work of God? I think there's this quote I heard one time. I'm sure this is a quote said by attributed to 1,000 different people, but basically, we take God seriously, we don't take ourselves seriously, and that's one of those ways. When I heard that for the first time, it was a major breakthrough for me in terms of how I think about the fear of the Lord and all that good stuff. But I think for me, it comes down to, I am so oftentimes I'm concerned so much more, not with necessarily the opinions of man, but of my own plans and my own self and what that's going to look like. And I think not only are there times where, maybe have the power to raise the dead and I'm robbing somebody else of that, but man, I'm ultimately robbing myself of that. And I'm robbing the people around me of being able to be somebody so fully alive and in touch with the Spirit that I am willing to make a fool of myself, or willing to be seen as a fool. And I think there's so much about following Jesus that comes back to the idea that Jesus talks about of becoming like a child, and becoming like a child who would be so bold and so earnest and so foolish as to interrupt something so solemn and so serious.
I think so. And I think, this is the part. I'm thinking of a very specific event. So that idea of, I don't want to be that person and I don't want to be that Christian. And man, I think I avoid being that Christian a lot.
Sure.
And most of the time I pat myself on the back. Well, at least I'm not that Christian, that kind of thing. There is I've heard of people throughout the years, and they're like devoted to asking every waitress, every barista, everybody, maybe even on every elevator, on every airplane ride, on everything, hey, can I pray for you? Is there something I can pray for you about? And I remember when I first heard it, which was, I didn't grow up with that, but probably in my 20s hearing about it and thinking, that's fascinating, But then it kind of became one of those things, I don't want to be that Christian, And so, that says a lot about me, that we could process. Recently, two things happened. There was a disaster that happened near us, a tornado that happened near us. And when I got the invitation to join a disaster relief group, they said, hey, part of the thing we want, they're recruiting people to come out and help them. And they're like, we want you to distribute supplies. And we also want you to pray with people and love on people and this kind of thing. And I think subconsciously, even before consciously, I said, if they ask me to pray, I will absolutely pray. I believe in prayer. But I'm not going to invade with my, say, hey, I don't want to connect me providing aid to them with, and now I'm going to load it up with religion, okay. Simultaneously, in a whole other track of my life, I'm going through this process. Like, I get up at 5:30 in the morning once a week, and I'm doing it as infrequently as possible, be assured. But I'm at 5:30, and there's a guy in California that's doing this disciple-making material with us that he's willing to get up at 3:30 in the morning to do this material. And part of it is, he says, I want you to be watching for people so that you can ask them, hey, what can I pray about? So it's funny. I'm really into what he's teaching about. That's so good. That's so good. Then I'm asked, and all of a sudden, and I think God sets these things up where I'm like, I'll never do that. And I'm like, I guess I'm doing that now, But now I'm inspired to watch for opportunities to pray for people in these ways. But the reason I've shied away from it, and I'm very convicted at this moment, is because I don't want to be awkward. I don't want to interrupt people. Now, I think there are certain people that'd be like, how can you be a preacher and think that way? And I'm just saying, I think that way.
Yeah.
And I think, man, I'm not even willing to say, hey, would you like me to pray with you? Yeah. Or is there anything I can pray about? And I'm like, what more would God do in my life if I entered in? And I'm like, he may use me to stop a funeral today. Yeah. And it's not about your doctrine. Your theology may say, well, he doesn't do that anymore. And I'm like, maybe not. Maybe he's not doing that. But I cannot say definitively.
But also, you're probably wrong.
Well, yeah, I cannot definitively say he can't.
Yeah. Yeah, I think as somebody who's never raised somebody from the dead, as I used to be very, very on the line on that. And I just think now, man, the miracles of God are all around us for us to see. And I think a lot of times my skepticism comes not because of a theological reason or because of the Bible. It's because of lack of experience. And I think that says a lot more about me than it says about God or the Bible. But I think there's a piece that you talked about for me, because I struggle very much same way as you, although I'm not technically a preacher or pastor, so I get more of a pass than your terrible sinfulness in terms of feeling awkward. Yes. Of course, just so we're all clear who has more points and less points. But I think about it's so much easier for me to feel compelled to ask somebody if I can pray for them or talk to them about Jesus or whatever it would be, if the focus. If I can truly focus in on who God is, if I can truly focus in on that God is a God that wants to weep with them, and God is a God that has compassion, and God is a God that wants to step into their pain with them, that already has and wants them to see it, that came down from majesty into the muck and mire. When I can fully see who Jesus is, and when he's not my pet guy who I really like to assign my favorite theological positions, or when I really like the sayings, or I really like the way, if I live out specific of his teachings, how it affects my day-to-day life. But when I realize who he is and what he came for, and he came to be somebody whose heart would go out to his people, then, man, I'm not going to say I accomplish it 100% more times or whatever the percentage would be, but I am so much more successful in being able to be okay with that awkwardness. And I think that's where I get caught up, is so often where I'm like, well, man, if I create this awkward situation, then they're going to be worried about, like, they're going to make the connections to all these other Christians who are awkward or did those things. And I'm like, why I won't have sensitivity to everybody's experience, but for my own personal feelings, like, about how somebody views me, why do I care if this other person, or if I think this other person, doesn't understand that I have a more nuanced theological position on God and what he's doing than what I would perceive other people who have talked to them. Okay, so I just had a moment here where I was thinking about when I was I might keep this in. I'm just gonna use this as my perplexion, because we're running out of time, and my very kind wife and child are hiding in the bedroom while we finish recording, which says something about what we're doing. So for those of you who don't know, when I like came back to fall in love with Jesus, it happened when I was 17 at a church camp, and I for a long time, God had been chasing after me. There had been a lot of whispers. My dad had left. There was clearly a God-sized hole in my heart that was ready to be fulfilled. So he was doing a lot of work underneath. But the culminating event for me being like, okay, Jesus is who he says he is, and I need to follow after him, was there was a night church camp where I got up and it was like a talent show sort of thing, and I just completely embarrassed myself and said some of those embarrassing things and made a complete and utter fool out of myself, like to the level, I might have shared this before in the podcast, but to the level where godly good men were coming alongside me and be like, it wasn't that bad. Which, if like some of the people that, like, Sean Kindle was somebody who came alongside me, like, Connor, it wasn't that bad. And Sean Kindle's like really trying, like, it was really, really bad. And there was a lot of anger over the things I said. There was a lot of hurt. And I remember after I got off the stage, I remember, like, this is one of those moments that I'm going to hold. This is going to sit with me for the rest of my life. For the rest of my life, when I think of the most embarrassing moments of my life, this will be it. And it'll just sit with me forever and ever and ever. And the thing that ultimately, one of the things that drew me to God that night was I felt the supernatural protection I could, like, feel it in my brain, this barrier between the embarrassment and the humiliation that I felt. And I felt God wrap his arms around me in that moment. And what is so funny to me now is the culminating event that made me choose God was becoming an utter and complete fool, and him protecting me in that. And the fact that I would then go about the next 10 to 15 years of my life being afraid of being a fool is just so silly and so sad. And so this is just a personal thing. Like, I'm actually realizing this right now, where, like, that is the thing that won me to Jesus. And yet I'm afraid of that. And that's just, I'm just processing. That's just sad. I just want to own that's sad. And I think I've robbed myself in a lot of ways.
If we had another hour, I could fill it. Because that right there, I think this, do I believe, and maybe it goes, we take God seriously but not ourselves. Maybe this falls into that concept, but it is that idea that the very word of God, these stories, is when we see them clearly, when we're walking behind Jesus, and he's got a big crowd, what do you think's about to happen? What I think's about to happen, there's going to be a teaching, a healing, maybe he's going to feed 5,000 people again, and then all of a sudden he intersects with a funeral, and I've not looked ahead on what happens after this funeral, but if it's like any one of Jesus, any of the other Jesus stories, you just move on to something totally different. Like, it feels almost non sequitur, except the thread that Jesus trusted God. He trusted God even with understanding he was a non-sinful human being, but still a non-omniscient human being. He didn't know everything. I think we make a bad assumption that Jesus is like, well, my itinerary for today is to encounter a centurion and this widow, and he doesn't know. He's intentionally modeling for us what it's like to move through life and come into the unknown with utter confidence that God is there, utter confidence that God wants you there because you're there. And that he's created these things in advance for you to do. That's literally Ephesians 2:10. That you are special and you are an expression of God, and God has equipped you for things that you don't know are coming, and you don't even know maybe how you're being equipped. And he says, I'm going to meet you there and encounter. And that's the beauty and the power of the Holy Spirit. And then I was taught for many years, you better ignore it. You better not notice it. And then that led me to be afraid of these interactions, because the big question was, am I really ready? Is this really God? These kind of things. Instead of saying, God, I know you're here, and I just want to be ready to participate. Will you give me courage? And I just think we've made it so unbiblical. I've made it so unbiblical the way I live out walking with God. And it makes my walk super... No, I was going to say superhuman. That's not what I mean. It makes my life completely void, completely absent of expecting the supernatural. And because I don't want to get it wrong, and I don't want to misrepresent, and these kind of things. And I'm not for lacking wisdom. I am saying wisdom of God only makes sense in the context of the power of God and the heart of God and the true God, not the God I make him to be, which is often just void of power.
Yeah. It comes from the confidence of knowing who God is and what he wants for me and what he wants for the person in front of me. That God is ultimately not trying to make Jason an automaton who shares my exact feelings on every single issue. That God is a God that is primarily focused on Jason loving him and Jesus loving Jason. And that becomes the discernment piece that we all have to remember when we're thinking about this, especially when we're stepping into awkward situations. Is this about God, or is this about am I willing to make this awkward? Am I willing to be made a fool? Is this about the love of God and being compelled by the very nature of the mission of the church and the mission of being a disciple of Jesus? Or is this to make somebody conform to who I want them to be and who I think they should be and the decisions they should make? And so that's, I think, just a good way to end it, because I know I've known a lot of people, and I've been the person that has been made awkward, and it wasn't about God and it wasn't about the person. And so I'm not saying that in any judgment over those specific instances, but just reminding myself, being bold for bold's sake, because you come off as great, is not the point of it. Being bold because that's where God has led you, and he's given you the power to be bold in that situation. That's I think that's the center of the cookie, and that's where I want to live. Man, I want a cookie now. Grace, peace, and love.